So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about tree diseases, and initially if you read it, the first title was Dangerous Tree Diseases, Should You Be Concerned? I modified it back to non-invasive tree disease or invasive tree diseases, but you still should be concerned. We heard a wonderful presentation if you were here 2 nights ago on invasive species, so I don't have to explain what non-native species are, but for those who weren't there, I'll just say quickly a non-native species is one that doesn't belong here. It's not indigenous to Canada, it's not indigenous to Ontario or North America. So with that in mind, I'd like to start with a quiz. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I want you to think for 30 seconds. How many tree species, to give the significance of this talk, how many tree species are listed as endangered in Ontario? And a follow-up to that question, I want you to answer, how many of those are caused by a non-native pathogen? You got 30 seconds, you're under pressure. You're back in school. Okay, enough time. We have 8 endangered tree species in Ontario. And how many are endangered because of a pathogen or a tree disease? Did anybody get 3? So we have American chestnut, butternut, and flowering dogwood that are all endangered, listed in the Invasive Species Act of Canada and in Ontario. And the ones above that are not listed, like where we see cherry birch is at risk because it's at the northern end of its range in southwestern Ontario. It doesn't do well in cold climate, and there's a very limited population. In fact, there's only one population of about less than 50 trees. Red mulberry is endangered because of hybridization with an invasive white mulberry. So people brought white mulberry in, it hybridizes, it breeds with white mulberry, the red mulberry, so we don't get pure red mulberries back. And there's about 300 of those still in existence. And it's also in its northern range, so it doesn't do well in our climate. And the other one, the cucumber magnolia, which is the only flowering magnolia tree that we have in Canada, it's at its northern range as well. So it's not endangered in the States. None of those 3 are endangered in the States. But because they're in their northern range, a little bit of habitat loss, but potentially with climate change, things getting warmer up here, they could sort of move back. And the last 2, black ash and pumpkin ash, are endangered because of, why? You know that. Right, emerald ash borer. So about 90% of the ash, black ash, have been decimated by emerald ash borer, which came into the province around 2002. And pumpkin ash was rare already. It was endangered before. There's only 2 or 3 trees left in Canada, apparently, and they're sort of struggling. Still some in the States, but even in the States, they're a little bit at risk. So jumping into the presentation, how did they get here? Well, a hitchhiker's guide to all invasive species is by containers. And about 70% of all containers that come to Canada, 70% are opened in Ontario, because this is the industrial part of Canada and Quebec, but 70% in Ontario. And with those, and they come in not just by ship into Ontario, but they can come into Vancouver or Halifax, and they're brought in by container on trains and opened here. They come up from the States on trucks. Sometimes ships that have come into the States, they're unloaded there, the containers, and brought into Canada. And in those containers, there's packing materials, usually pallets of the way a lot of insects have got in, plant seeds have got in that way, and wood products. So green material is bad for importing because a lot of pests and insects can come that way. And then nursery stock. Nursery stock is one of the biggest ones for a whole host of pests, and we'll see how important that is with our pathogens. And of course, once they're here, they migrate and move. And a lot of that is done by human assistance. Some of them is just the spread of the organisms themselves, as we're going to see tonight. So this is not how they get here. They don't declare themselves at the border. They're very cryptic. Often we don't even know what the species is. They have sometimes they're coming from a country where they're not a problem because they're native species in Asia or Europe or wherever they're coming from. Those tree species have learned how to exist with those diseases, just as our native tree diseases do. So our native tree diseases cause problems at times, usually when we have drought or strong wet events or major disturbances. we might have some mortality happening with our trees, but most of our trees die from senescence or mild diseases, but they don't wipe out a whole species, causing them to be endangered. So here's a table that I produced many years ago when I was actually working, and on the far side you can see a whole whack of diseases. I don't want to read through them all, but white pine blisterus I'm going to talk about tonight a bit because there's a lot of misinformation and information that people need to hear, and we have a lot of white pine around us, so you'll see some of this disease if you look carefully enough in town. Beech bark disease, American chestnut blight, I'm not going to speak about tonight. Dutch elm disease I'm going to mention but not speak about. It's been around for over 100 years. But I am going to address butternut canker, oak wilt, and beech bark disease. Beech leaf disease, which is very new. If you look on the introduced by, that's the important slide where you see how they got here. So these forest pathogens have arrived on infected nursery stock or wood material. Where the question marks are, there's a lot of speculation of how they got there or here. And sometimes we do find out, but it takes years to figure that out because sometimes we don't know where these pests' origin are. So they can exist, we can identify the pathogen, or it gets a new name, or a name that's new to science, and then we find out many years later, oh, that fungus is from Europe, or it's from Asia, and we'll see that in a little bit. The other aspect I want you to look under is Ontario, to see when they were introduced to Ontario, and how new some of those are. So white pine blisterus has been here for 100 years, hard to imagine. And we don't think of that as an invasive disease. A lot of people think, foresters especially, who should know, it's just been here forever. And we'll talk about some of the management strategies with regards to that. So some of them are very old, and some of them are very new, but they're all not native to our forest conditions. Just look at the photos for a second. This is Dutch elm disease. This is in Chicago, Illinois, the city of Chicago. 1971 is the top photo. The bottom photo is late 1980s. So in 20 years, the streets of Chicago went like that to the photo below. So when Dutch elm disease came in, it wiped out the elms. It's still wiping out elms. And it's not on the endangered species list because elms can still survive. They don't get big, usually. They don't get to the large diameter ones that we see in the past. And I grew up in downtown Montreal, Westmount. And where I grew up, I looked like that photo above. And if you look today, you won't see trees like that in Westmount. You might see one or two. They're not that size. So what does that widespread mortality result in, or what does it do? Well, the standard forestry things, loss of forest cover. So with these species disappearing, the elms were in our native forests. They just weren't in urban forests in the past. Reduced biodiversity. Biodiversity has become much more important to us. I would say 30 years ago, we were talking about it, but we weren't doing very much with it. We were more concerned about economics. But suddenly, the province developed a biodiversity strategy, and then all the other little species and big species became important. So much more money, you'll see in a minute, was spent on trying to redress those. Change in ecosystem structure is a given. I threw cultural up there because it doesn't really fit in as a result of loss of economics. But I think of my community in Westmount, how it changed from that photo like above to what it is today is not something attractive to me, culturally. And of course the economic impacts are big, and we know about timber production and loss of wood and these things, but a lot of people don't realize that their home values are really dependent on trees. Those properties with big trees and attractive trees make your property more valuable. And then the other thing that a lot of people don't realize with these diseases, because they're so widespread, is the cost of management. Extremely expensive to do the science. I don't have the numbers tonight because it would bore you, but the expense of managing some of these diseases is really, really high. And of course, keeping them out of the country, which is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's responsibility, is also incredibly expensive, as you'll see in a few minutes, keeping them out and monitoring them. So I want to start with white pine blisterus. The white pine, a terribly important tree, our provincial tree, surrounds our community here. We got lots of beautiful specimens. The disease has been here over 100 years. Really, probably the most expensive softwood we have in eastern North America. If you're going to buy it, it's expensive. Woodworkers and builders loved it in the old days because it has very little tangential and radial shrinkage when it's dry. So it was used in window frames and doors because of that. So, it kept houses warmer and you didn't have to kiln dry it as much. The disease gets its name because of the blisters it forms. And this is these, what we call pustules or blisters. They're actually going to be out in the next few weeks. They come out very, very early in spring, middle of April, depending on the season. They last about maybe 3 or 4 weeks. And it's caused by the fungus Quinartium rubicula. And that fungus is really kind of interesting because it actually has 2 hosts. It lives part of its life on white pine, and it spends part of its life on ribes, which are currants and gooseberries. And the disease in this stage, which we'll see shortly, it can blow quite a distance. Those spores, when they're released, can go hundreds of kilometers in the wind. And when they go that hundreds of kilometers, if they land on a ribes, that's a currant bush over there, looks like a maple leaf, they are the first plants, shrubs, that come out in the spring. So not the herbaceous. Some of the herbaceous come out earlier, like the soft, grassy, greeny things. But these things come out before the amelanchier, the service berries, and you'll see them. So when you're walking around Grouse Park or whatever, there's a few out there. They don't really like dry, sandy soils, but they do like moist, wet, around streams. And there's about 7 species that we have in Ontario, and they can become infected quite easily. This is what the spores look like on the back of a leaf. This was in our lab. We took this. We were actually infecting trees, looking for resistance. So that's one of the research things that people have been doing, putting these spores on top of lots of trees and seeing if they become resistant, if they grow without the disease. This is a more advanced stage of the same spores. So at this stage, these spores are reinfecting currant bushes. So they're growing during the summer. They're making a lot of these spores and infecting themselves and other currant bushes around. So lots of augmenting the spores in the area. At this stage, these are called teliospores. They're sort of little tendrils. You'll see those. They look exactly like that brown. They'll release these very large spores that only go about 1,000 feet. So from the currant bush, it only can go about 900 to 1,000 feet to the leaves of a white pine. And white pine are 5-needle pines, and you can see these little lesions here. This was infected in our lab, so we do and know, for indeed, it's white pine blister rust. And those spores will germinate, and it can take them some time. It might take a year or 2 on those needles. White pine needles usually last about 3 years. And then we start to see these infections show up on the branches or the base of the seedling. Here you can see quite a nice infection, discoloration. And it came from that one little infected needle there. The fungus Quinartium worked its way back. And here you can see 3 infection points. Now, normally we see a lot of infections on seedlings and things close to the ground because those spores, when they come from the ribes, need to have 48 hours of 100% humidity. If they don't get that, they don't live, they don't dry, they dry out. They're very delicate. So if we have young seedlings about on the forest floor and there's lots of vegetation and very poor air movement, they can get the disease quite easily. And that's why a lot of plantations fail, because if we don't manage the vegetation below, or if they're planted in frost pockets, wrong places, bottom of slopes where it's damp and wet, they can become infected. So here we see an infection point. Usually where the infection takes place, the needles hang on. And a little bit later, we start to see these spore structures. So these are the ones we'll be seeing in the next week or 2. The ones over here haven't fully developed. These ones I just turned on its side when I took the picture to show the spores being released. And that's typically what you can see. You can see them on the bole of the tree and also on the branches. And normally they come in on a whorl. So it might be one infected branch and it comes down and girdles that branch. So here we see an older tree. and it forms a canker. So these are when the spores are released. And the tree produces a lot of resin. We call it resinosis. It tries to wall off the fungus. It's not successful doing that. But if it was an insect or something boring into it, it would wash the insect out because of the resin. But it can take years for a tree to die. So a tree that we're looking at over here, it could have taken many, whoops, I really went nuts there. It can take quite a few years for that. So the infection probably came in on one of these branches, probably this little one, and is slowly girdling that tree. Here we see another tree showing a lot of resinosis, and you can see some chewing on it. A lot of rodents like to eat those spores, just like we like mushrooms. Those spores, when they come out this time of the year, often they'll chew them off, and you might look and say, what chewed on that? And there won't be any evidence of the fungus there. It's all chewed off. Here's a tree, a plantation with a lot of failure in it, and that's because these trees were planted on the wrong site. The first tree we're looking at, these trees are about 7 years old, and you can see that it recently died, probably last fall. They're still hanging on to their needles because they'll hang on for at least a season or two. This tree here is yellow, and if we were to look at the base of any of these trees, we could probably see a canker on there. In fact, I know there's a canker on those ones because I looked at them. And the infection took place very, very early. So I say these trees are 7 years old, but they work in whorls, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and they probably planted 2 plus 2 seedlings. So 2 years growing in the nursery, 2 years out in the field, or when they're planted. So those infections took place very, very early, and they took place at the bottom, and they've girdled this tree. That tree is holding off a little bit longer, but it will succumb to the disease. And then we have a healthy tree appearing over here. And I say it's healthy because you can see the candelabras. Those are the buds that are elongating. The needles are just about to elongate. And this is taken about in June, late June. This tree doesn't have those candles on it. It's struggling to produce the energy. So not good leaf development, and those trees are going to succumb to the disease shortly. And even though this tree looks healthy over here, you might see one little branch there indicating it does have an infection, which might work its way back to the bole of that tree, the base, and that tree might go too. Now, somebody asked me once before, does it get it in the crown? Because I talk about all the time it being in the lower part because of relative humidity and what it needs to grow. But the spores sometimes can waft up into the air. It's not impossible. And if they infect a branch, we call that flagging. So this branch over here has been infected. It could be ice damage in the winter, and it just took a while for that branch to die and die out. It could be some other mechanical damage. But in most cases, it could be white pine blister rust. And if that's the case, once it gets to the bole of the tree, it can take many years to girdle, and this part will die. So this is an example of that tree here. So this tree probably has white pine blister rust right about there. That part died over many, many years because the tree actually grew for quite a few years before it got girdled, before it made it around and killed the top of that tree. This tree is still surviving. These branches have now trying to reach and become dominant and be the crown of that tree or the leader, just as when you deadhead a plant and it starts to get bushy. That's what these trees are doing. Now, sometimes this can be a lightning strike, and that can be confusing. I mentioned that white pine is not endangered here, but there's 4 species of white pine, 5-needle pines in the Western Canada, and 2 of them are endangered, white bark pine and limber pine from white pine blister rust. And there, we often see it in the upper crown because the spores can come down the slopes, these cool, damp weather, they call katabatic winds. Warm winds blow up mountain slopes. At night, they come down with the cool, dense air. And in the lower valleys, somebody's laughing because I'm such a fan of meteorology that's how these trees can get affected. So they can be tall trees in the Western Canada getting infected more in their upper crowns, lower crowns too, but more in the upper crowns due to that moisture. Jumping into beech bark disease, which is one of my favorite diseases. It's caused by 2 invasive organisms, a beech scale, Cryptococcus phaguesuga, and a fungal pathogen that works with it called Neonectria coccinea or Neonectria coccinea vaginata. Here you're looking at a beautiful beach. This tree was huge. And those little pockmarks you see it on are the fruiting bodies of beach bark disease. And this disease came into Nova Scotia in 1890. Well, actually, the scale insect came in 1990, or 1890, sorry. And it's been moving westward and southward ever since. And when beach scale came in, they identified it, and it's probably been there a little bit earlier, because when I show you some of the pictures of it, it's very small, hard to see. But about 12, 20 years after it came in, the fungus started to express itself, and they started seeing mortality in those trees. And then they said, well, what's going on with this? And so the disease has progressed from 1890, and it finally made it to Ontario in 1990. And what we saw in 1990 was the scale. And shortly after that, we started seeing, or I started hearing a lot of people complaining about trees being unsafe, cracking, falling. We call it beach snap. And having lived in New Brunswick and being very familiar with beach bark disease, and then coming to Ontario and saying, wow, you got smooth bark trees, and it was sort of an eye-opener. I sort of knew what was going on, but we never had a provincial survey of where we found beach bark disease. We didn't even know really where our beach is, because when we manage our forest, everything across here, below Algonquin Park and up, this is all private land in Ontario, and the province doesn't manage the forest below that. We call it the area of the undertaking is the industrial forest is above that line, everything below is private land, and beach is mostly where you can see those triangles below. So what we're looking at here is scale insect is the blue triangles, and where we found the fungus, the red circles, in 2004. And in my mind, I see a triangle there. I see a blue triangle going up like this roughly, and coming across like this. And then inside that triangle, I see a second triangle of red circles. So I mentioned that beach bark disease comes in first, the scale comes in first, and 2 to 12 years later, you see the fungus come in. So we call where the scale comes in the advancing front of the disease. So we only find scale insect, and then later we find the fungus, and we call that the killing front. The trees die very, very quickly, and there's a third thing in the middle here. They call it the aftermath forest, where the disease has been for a while. You still find beech trees, but they're not the very large smooth bark beech trees we've seen. They're quite a bit smaller, they're gnarly, and I'll show you some pictures of those. Here's the scaled insect. It's about 1.5 millimeters long, nondescript. It has a little stylus like a mosquito, proboscis. It sticks it into the thin bark of the beech. It changes the bark somehow that the fungus can take hold. The insect is parthenogenic, so it reproduces without sex. It can reproduce very, very quickly in a very short period of time, but usually it takes years. Here's Hillary Veen. She's not a scaled insect, but this is at Shaw Woods about 18 years ago or so. We noticed that the scale was coming in lightly. This is very, very heavy scale on this tree. This tree is just covered with scale. And if you look in the back, there's a whole bunch there as well. And then this is not in Shaw Woods, but this is what those trees looked like some time later. And if you've been to Shaw Woods, I can't remember how many years ago, but just recently, the last 5 years, they cut a whole bunch of trees down in Shaw Woods because of beech bark disease. And the reason that they did that, well, I'm not there yet, but this is what the fungus looks like really close. If you look at one of those red little dots, they look like eyes to me. But when you look at these, they look like little bunches of grapes. Those are the fruiting bodies. And normally, you see them like this, but sometimes there's so many of them, the tree looks like it was painted lightly red. And what the tree tries to do in those little eyes, it tries to wall off the fungus. It's showing some resistance, tolerance to the disease, and it produces these abnormal growths. Sometimes they're circular, they're little bumps. And the tree, over a number of years, because it doesn't die always quickly, some trees do in the killing front, but others hang on. So it's a very slow process in some cases for the trees that are showing some kind of tolerance to the disease, not resistance. And up in just below Huntsville, we had a research plot we put in 2010, and it was at North Rail Lake Road, just below Huntsville a little bit. That plot had 68 trees in it. So on this axis, you're looking at number of trees, 68. And here we have the years across. And here we have vigor rating. All you really have to know about vigor rating, it's a way forest health people rate trees, amongst other things. But anything green here is a healthy tree. So these green things are healthy trees. So if you like, in 2010, we had 68 trees. Of those 68 trees, 60 were healthy. A vigor rating 5 is a dead tree. We had 5 dead trees. In 5 years, to 2015, we had 14 healthy trees and 41 dead trees. So if you like, the health of those trees dropped very quickly, or if you like, the mortality rate of those trees increased very quickly. And when those trees die very quickly, I should mention that beech is very susceptible to about 45 other wood rotting fungi. So when they have those little cracks in the bark because of the disease, other fungi can get in and they snap. We call it a term beech snap. They become very, very brittle and they can break. And that's what people were reporting earlier in south, way further down in that triangle I showed you. And here you can see some of the damage. This is my favorite spot, campsite 1313. Not a good choice. This was Killbear Provincial Park in 2013. That first slide I showed you where the advancing front was, we just had the scale insect. And we were educating foresters and parks people and things about the disease because most people in Ontario weren't aware of it. If you didn't, that was our job as foresters and forest pathologists to know these things. But because there wasn't many people paying attention, the disease sort of slipped in. So campsite 1313 is in Killbear Provincial Park, very popular, the 3rd most visited park in Ontario. At this campsite, there was 2 families camping there. There was a couple of picnic tables. The day after they were there, this beech tree snapped. You can't see the picnic tables at the site. That's some of the tree there. And the park got really concerned when they closed in the fall, in September, the long weekend. They spent just under $1.4 million, $1.39 or $1.37 million removing hazardous beech trees. That's a lot of money to spend in just one little area to fix that problem. So campsite 1313 you may not want to visit, or it's safe now. What do our beech trees look like and what's the prognosis for them? What are they going to look like in the future? Well, if you go to the Maritimes, this is what a typical beech looks like. It's very gnarly. Most people don't recognize them if they come from Ontario to there. And sometimes people, certainly from the Maritimes, when they come here, they're in awe how big some of our beech trees are and smooth. We still have those around. The beech bark disease is throughout its range in Ontario. There's still some good places where you find healthy beech, but there's probably scaled insect there, and we're saying not likely. So are we going to have beech in the future? With beech bark disease, yes, because they are showing some resistance and tolerance. And some work that a researcher done in New Brunswick, her name was Judy Lowe, about 30 years ago, she put some transects through New Brunswick forest and found there was about a 1 to 6% resistance that she was finding. But that work was our tolerance. So the difference between resistance and tolerance. Tolerance means the tree can get the infection, the disease, and it can still live. So it's like getting a cold, you can still live. Resistance means you don't get the cold. You don't get the disease at all. And some of the Americans' research are finding that they can find trees that are showing some tolerance and resistance, about 1 to 5%. And there's work about collecting those trees and seeing if we can find those trees and augment them and put them out into the environment. Very little money being spent on that, I should say, but they're doing it. Where have all the butternuts gone? Well, they've gone to butternut canker, virtually every one. Butternut canker, well, butternuts are fast-growing trees. They live about to 70 years on average. The wood is often called a white walnut. Beautiful wood, not a commercial tree. It grows in riparian areas, so wet areas along streams and riverbanks. Hard to find them in clumps. They're usually linear, so putting plots in is difficult. And here we see a butternut tree, and this is on the experimental farm I did some work down there for a number of years, and I saw this tree actually die. And these are epicormate shoots when they all tough out from a buried bud that comes from being buried in the wood and then finally grows out. It's the last kick of a can when you see a tree doing this. And you can see the range of butternut down here. It's very extensive. It's throughout the range. And there's the fungus on the tree there, or how it's expressed. Often it's just a black discoloration oozing at the beginning. Oh, and I should mention, it's got the most wonderful name of the pathogen, Ophagonomia clavigenenti juglanacerum. Yeah, it's always fun to say that. It took me a while to say it. The disease was identified in Wisconsin, first identified in Wisconsin in 1967. It's been around a lot longer than that, the disease or the destruction. And at first it was misidentified. They saw some twigs dying back for a number of years, and people called it another fungus, Melanchonus oblongata. And then they said, oh, it must be a more virulent strain, because they started to see this other fungus causing mortality. And it's only when people started looking at it a little bit more in Wisconsin when they were finding they were losing about 90% of their butternut. And as I said, butternut's not a commercial species, so people don't pay attention to trees that aren't economically valuable to society. But again, when I said biodiversity start creeping into people's minds, into governments, all of a sudden they start paying attention and looking for them. The disease was found in Ontario, southern Ontario in 1991. And when we aged, or wasn't aging the cankers, and then I wasn't working for the government then, but when they aged the cankers, they figured that they were about 10 or 11 years old, I recall. So the disease probably was here earlier. And that's just the tree that they discovered. There was never, ever a survey done in the province of Ontario at that stage. This is what the twigs look like when they're infected. Usually they're in the upper crown of the tree. The bark splits open. They have these little pegs, and they produce these very sticky spores. Those sticky spores, insects like to eat and move around on. Birds land on them, squirrels and things collecting the nuts get the spores on them, travel to that tree or other trees. And this is a butternut cuculio, a weevil, if you like, very particular to its life cycle on this tree. I tried to include slides in here that are local so people might know some of these areas. This is Pansy Patch Park. Back in 2001 or 2002, I got a call. My office was in Sault Ste. Marie, that's where I was housed. And these trees were dying. They were concerned because big limbs were coming down. Butternut's a protected species. You're not allowed to cut them, not allowed to harvest them. If you have one in your property, you're not allowed to remove it. If you want to remove it, you have to get a special butternut tree inspector come in to give you the permission to say that this tree is very hazardous, you can remove it. If you want to remove one that's still healthy to build a Walmart parking lot, there's all sorts of hoops and jumps you have to go through. This is a typical what a canker can look like, and there's many, many cankers that a tree can have, hundreds of them sometimes. Just back to Pansy Patch, these trees are really in poor shape. These are vigor ratings 4. They're all tough. They're probably going to die within a year or two. They were removed. But here's one that's still fairly healthy looking. But once they get the canker, they don't seem to last very long. This is later stages of the canker on the right-hand side. They get very gnarly, and they break down very quickly. So in 2008, the Endangered Species Act came out. I think it was 2006 or 7. And all of a sudden, I was able to get money. We were able to do some research on butternut. We didn't know where they were. And I recall, it was a long story, but I wasn't sure what we should do with butternut. So we had an international butternut meeting held in Ottawa, brought all the people from all over North America to say, what's happening with butternut, what we should do. And of course, the first thing came up was we should have a survey and know where our butternuts are and what kind of condition they are. So in 2008, I initiated what's supposed to be a 25-year survey, which is a joke because governments don't give you money for 25 years. And we put in 60 plots of butternut to look at their health. This red line represents the range of butternut. So it doesn't really grow on the shield here very much, but you will find butternut in North Bay, Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, where people had moved nuts to plant them. We talked about vigor rating already. So green is healthy trees, And you can see here in the east along the Ottawa River and where we are, the trees seem to be a little bit more healthy. Red, and this is an average of approximately 25 trees, 60 plots. So when you see a red, on average, those trees are not doing well. There could be a healthy tree in there, but most of the time, so measuring a bunch of trees, and that's the average. So there was some interest that, oh wow, something over in the Ottawa Valley here, they seem to be doing better. Well, my plan was to initiate the study again 5 years later, but it took 7 years, almost 8 years to do it. And on this graph here, which is unpublished, we have a number of trees and a vigor class. Remember I said 1 and 2 are relatively healthy trees, and 5 are dead trees. Well, and the blue is 2008, and let's say the red is 2014. So of very, very healthy trees in 2008, we had 437, and 7 years later, we had 27. And then in 2000, and we never measured the dead trees on those sites. And in 2014, we had 495 die in that period of time. So again, you can see what I showed you before with the beech, a decline in the health of the trees and an incline in poor health of the trees and then mortality. So we still have some really nice butternuts around. This is a beautiful specimen just found south of Renfrew County. And that was the area forester at the time. And we spent a lot of time looking at these trees. This is in Renfrew County, and there's, it's against a lot of cut. And I put this gnarly fence thing in here because this had loads of young butternut in them. You couldn't remove them, you couldn't clean it up. There were other species in there too. It was more like a garbage dump along the railway track. That's a railway track there. And a lot of those trees had canker and may or may not amount to much. Moving on to, yes.
Can I just ask you about that pansy park,
Yeah.
pansy park picture? Well, you just said there was one that still looked healthy. Does it have any chance, or once it's in the area, that healthy?
No, we didn't remove all the trees there at that time. They were done over a period of time. But yeah, we would try to hang on to the healthier trees and prune branches off and keep them on as long as possible. But when they're hazardous, they're removed.
But
there's still
the chance of not getting the disease with other trees so close with the disease.
Oh yeah, it's very possible you're going to get the disease, but some trees are more tolerant to the disease. So that tree I showed you beside it, that was actually still in pansy patch, and if you go there today, you'll still find butternut. You're not going to find them this big, you're going to find them this big. And those ones are heavily cankered too. So go to pansy patch and see them. Oak wilt disease, a very new disease to Ontario, just found in 2023. I spent most of my career on this disease. Felt like I was wasting my time. Anyways, it's caused by Bretziella fagacerum, and this is a pocket of mortality. Before I jump into disease, because I want to go through the slide to show you how severe this disease is. This is a field, and here you can see some white trees. These trees had died 3 years ago. So this pocket is 3 years old, and you can see how many trees have died. This is where we figured this is not in Canada, by the way, these are all states. So this is where the infection came in. So this is year 1. And year 2, these purplish off-color trees here, that was the second year of mortality happening. And this one here is the 3rd year. So when this photo was taken, these yellowing trees are the trees that just recently died. Now this disease, and these trees that are green in the center here are not oak trees. This disease is very, very severe. It kills oak trees in a matter of 4 to 6 weeks. Red oak especially, so Quercus rubra, our native red oak, is very, very susceptible. But in the red oak group, there's a lot of other oaks. So we just have red oak in our area, but there's a whole whack of species that we call red oaks. It's like calling a Ford a car, but there's so many models of Ford, but they're all infected, or they can be. White oak is a little bit different. It can get infected and it can die, but usually it persists, and sometimes it's just a branch, and it's much slower acting. And that's because of tylosis. In the vessels of trees, they can produce these little buds or bulbs, and they stop the conduction of nutrients and water up the tree. So basically what happens with oak wilt and Dutch elm disease, the tree is not getting water and it dies from starvation of water. In red oak, if you're a liquor drinker, you know that they age wine and alcohol in white oak barrels. That's because they can produce lots of tylosis and they can control it. You put wine in a white oak barrel, it doesn't leak. You put wine in a red oak barrel, it leaks. It's like a straw with a lot of sieves. So red oak leaks, and the fungus can grow very quickly through those vessels. 90% of the root spread, and that's why that pocket was so big in 3 years, 90% of the spread of the fungus, the Bretziella, is through these root grafts. And trees usually of the same species can graft their roots together. Most tree species do this. So, red pine with red pine, we know in plantations, 28 trees at a 2 by 2 meter spacing, all those trees are connected. In oak, usually growing wild, they're not grown in plantations, a lot of trees are connected, so it can move through the trees. That's how most of the infection takes place with this disease. The other way this disease spreads is through sap beetles and bark beetles, mostly sap beetles, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute, and certainly wood products. Moving wood with bark on, moving live oak with bark on is a real no-no. This is a map. I know it's poor, but it's not mine. It's the Canadian Food Inspection Agency map from 2024, I should say. What you're looking at, these little green triangles, is where they surveyed for oak disease. They've been surveying for oak disease for quite a few years now. And it's usually done at borders and anywhere where there's a mill that might be importing wood in. And our first order of defense with this disease is really phytosanitary certificates, moving wood across the border for industrial purposes. And then, of course, people moving firewood, you're supposed to declare it, not move it across the border. But the disease was found in 2023 in 2 locations, 2 in Niagara Falls, and 1 way up here in Springfield, just outside of Barrie, Ontario. And it's kind of a mystery or surprise. I spent a lot of time down here because there's a Belle Isle between Detroit and Windsor, and we know it was on Belle Island. We actually helped discover it, Ontario. And it was only 500 meters from Windsor, and we always thought that that's where it's going to come in, that's where it's going to come in. But it actually came in here, and when it was found on a private citizen's property. There was 3 infected oak trees. The citizen had these trees that were dead, and he hired an arborist to take them down, and the arborist was knowledgeable enough to realize that there was something with these trees, reported them, and that's our first find of oak wilt in Canada. Those trees were deep burial. The way that we normally get rid of contaminated pests like these is 6-foot burial, like humans. If it's not, it depends on how much there is, but that's one of the preferred ways. The other way is bring in these very huge, large incinerators on transport trucks and burn things. Not just wood, but chickens and whatever they want to get rid of for these diseases. And in the States, what they do, because they have lots of oak wilt's all through here. And so we were trying to protect ourselves in Canada because we don't have it. And it's been very, very costly to them and also devastating to oak trees. I throw this in here just to show us where the populations of oak are. So this is all species of oak in Ontario. This is a map from Ontario government. And you can see the density of where oak is. Not surprising it came in here, I guess, because of the density of oak. And those spores are cryptic. People bringing firewood in. It's probably how it came in. Maybe a bug made it, but these bugs aren't good flyers. So lots of oak, and just for our knowledge, there's quite a few bit of oak up here. We have red oak and bur oak. Bur oak is a white oak group. So we're susceptible. What does this disease look like? Well, in a single tree, it can die very quickly, as I said, 4 to 6 weeks. Normally it takes a season, and people might take several years before they notice it, even in the States. But that tree is died. Most of the time, the infection comes in a small branch and works its way down. The other sign that something's wrong is when you see leaves, and for that tree, to have that discoloration in June or July or anywhere during the growing season. Most of the time, the oaks, as you know, or even around here, there's a nice white oak beside the long-term care. You can see that it hangs onto its leaves. These are shedding their leaves, and when oaks do that, you know there's something wrong. The leaves are quite diagnostic, too, if you can put it all together. Usually they go a tawny brown or a bronzy brown, and they have very angular discolorations. The leaves usually brown from the far end of the leaf towards the base, and often from the leaf margin towards the midrib of the leaf. But when you're looking at leaves, they're not, especially when there's lots of them on the ground, they're drying up, they're crinkly, the photos I'm showing you are really good examples, but when you're out there in the field finding those, there's anthracnose that can look like that. There could be drought events that make the needles or the leaves difficult to look at. So very difficult to diagnose in the field. We use molecular means. So here you can see again the leaf curling and drying back from the distal end. And here another way we can somewhat diagnose the disease in the field is this vascular streaking. And here you can see along the base here there's some streaking. So this is a wilt disease. It's plugging up the vessels of the tree, working the same way that Dutch elm disease. So people are familiar with Dutch elm disease. This works very similar. One thing that's a little bit different than Dutch elm disease and other diseases, it produces these spore pressure pads. So this is where the bark's been removed, and you can see this. There's 2 spore pressure pads here. That's a bunch of mycelium, like spaghetti of the threads of the fungus. It produces a lot of spores. It's about a centimeter and a half, and it exerts a great deal of pressure on the bark, and it causes the bark to crack. There are other things that can cause bark to look like this, but if we hack the bark off here in trees that are symptomatic, we'll find these spore mats, white at first, turning this mousy gray, very attractive to insects who are trying to eat those spores, and an older pad, where the fungus is disintegrated, but there's still a bit of a scar and stain, and especially in an area where there's the disease. If we were to remove the bark, here's a bit of a pressure pad left, and here are some of these little, what they're called sap beetles, nectuidid beetles. There's about 94 species in the United States. They're not all on oak trees or trees. They're on all sorts of, I learned a lot about this insect. They're on a lot of different plants. They're on grains, but they are attracted to your beer, apple juice, pop, your sandwiches when you're eating in the spring. And these beetles, if they're feeding on these spores, and these are native beetles. These aren't bad guys. These are guys and gals who live here. And they're different colors. So these guys are feeding here, and what they're attracted to is fresh sap. That's why they're called sap beetles. So usually they fly up into the crown, and if there's a broken branch in the tree or a tree that's been pruned or some kind of mechanical damage and the bark is gone or removed, these guys can carry in spores and potentially infect the tree. So if you're driving in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and even Michigan, they had these signs up. This is quite an old sign from about 20 years ago. They had these signs, don't prune in May or June. And when we got interested in oak wilt, we started thinking, well, things are always different when you're further south. What's it up here? Are these bugs around when we're here? Do we have the same species that they have in the States? So one of our researchers, Sharon Reed at OFRI, the Ontario Forest Research Institute, she implemented a study to start looking at these beetles. And what we found out, these beetles were flying much later. So in Ontario, we say don't prune between April and November, and that's the growing season. So these beetles are out a lot more than what other people figured. And it also caused some policy issues because you want to be right. People are saying, well, I shouldn't prune my tree then? Like, who's telling me that? So we base everything on science. Science-based is what we worked with. But what I would say to shorten that is prune in the wintertime if you're concerned about your oak tree. The other thing is, and we see this story over and over, don't move firewood. It's just not for insects, emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle. It's really about everything. And even though we don't have oak wilt in our area, now that it's in the province, I say the cat's out of the bag, and it's only a matter of time. It might be another 10 years before we find another spot, but we're going to see them. And if you look at what happened with beech bark disease, how that moved, if you looked at how that's happened with butternut canker, and some of the things I'm talking about, these things, once they're here, there's no magic bullet for any of these forest pathogens. There's nothing going to stop them. How they treat oak wilt in Michigan, so they have it big time, and a lot of states do this. They use this vibratory plow. So that first slide I showed you with that pocket, that large pocket, the 3-ear thing, they would go around the perimeter of that and try to sever the roots. Now, one of the interesting things about this disease, it's very virulent, it kills trees quickly, but it's also a weak fungus. It's overtaken by other fungi. So if you can kill the tree, or if you can sever the roots and stop them from connecting and other fungi enter, then it doesn't move through the root system very well. Very, very costly method. I'm not sure how that would work in Ontario. It certainly would work on sandy soils in places, but on some of the places where we have, like here, if we were trying to treat our bur oaks and things, this may not work. The other method that they developed is injections of chemicals, what are they called? Fungicides. And this is the typical way they treat Dutch elm disease, high-value trees, very, very expensive. Inject a whole bunch of fungicide into the tree. And we're doing this with emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is not a fungicide, it would be an insecticide. This protects the tree, but it doesn't treat a tree that's already infected. So you would use this before the tree got infected. Very, very expensive methods. These cost thousands of dollars, depending on the diameter of the tree, and you have to do it every 2 years. So these are not control methods. They're methods of protecting a little bit of what we have. And the final disease I want to talk about is beech leaf disease. And this is, I think, one of the interesting ones, and I think it's going to be another insult for beech. We already talked about beech bark disease and the conditions of those trees, and it's not wiping out beech. So beech are always going to be on the landscape with regards to beech bark disease. They're just not going to be pretty trees, possibly. But beech leaf disease is called by Lilienthus crenati McCanni, which is a worm. It's a nematode, a little tiny worm. It's kind of a special little worm. It's only about 1 millimeter in length. And it has this unique ability to be able to dry itself out almost completely, called bioanhydro. So it means it can dry itself out and then reconstitute itself. I didn't say that right, but. And that little guy, I'm just going to back up one slide. What you're seeing here in this leaf is these dark striations. That's where the nematode is, inside between the veins of the leaves. It moves in water. It actually gets into the leaf through the stomata. So the stomata is where oxygen exchange. It's really, really small, and it needs moisture to do that. We're not sure where this disease came from. We suspect Asia. In fact, the Lilienthus crenata was recently described in Japan. And when they found the North American one, and it was just named McCanni just a couple of years ago, they thought that it came from Japan initially, and then when they did some work and took our species and compared them molecular-wise, they were a little bit different. So then they came up with the subspecies McCanni. So the Japanese one's Lilienthus crenati, subspecies crenati, and ours is McCanni. So the insect, or I should say the worm, the insect distorts the leaf of the tree, causes that dark green banding, discoloration, and it reduces the photo capacity of the tree to produce sugars and survive. And I wrote down may predispose trees to secondary infections, but anything that weakens a tree predisposes them to other things. And of course, we didn't know at first it was going to cause tree death. And so this is what it looks like a little bit closer up. And even in the winter, you can identify this. And when you're looking for these, it's not easy because you don't know where it is. And when we found it in Ontario in 2017, our technicians were out looking for it. There's so many, you'd have to look at so many trees to find it. So kudos for them for finding it. But the darkening stripes is a characteristic you'll see. The leaf curling, the leaves tend to get thicker. Sometimes they produce these little blisters on these. This is where they all are. They overwinter in the buds and in the bud scales. So at this time or later in the season, they sort of migrate back into the bud scales. They overwinter. They can dry out quite a bit. They're in the bud scales already, so when the leaves elongate, they emerge and they affect the leaves. It can cause reduced leaf size, premature leaf drop, and bud failure over time. So many years of infection, we can see the buds. You don't find the buds, and you sort of wonder why, but with all these symptoms showing up. So you can hear just some examples of the leaves curling and the blotchiness. And often when you're looking at beech trees that are stressed from drought or other pathogens or insects, it can be very difficult to identify. And I'll talk about that in a minute. What they're finding out is the progression. It's 1 to 2 years of the leaf symptoms. And then 3 to 5 years, you're seeing reduced canopy. So this is looking up into a canopy of a bunch of beech. Very small leaves, very few leaves. In my experience, this could be beech bark disease, because this is what we also saw with beech bark disease back when we were doing a lot of work with beech bark disease. In fact, I have photos that look like that, but this is the worm. What they noticed is a lot of young trees were becoming infected, and then death. So the concern I think we might have with this beech leaf disease is we have beech bark trees that are stressed from beech bark disease. We lost the big trees. We have these cankered trees. We have the understory that's still doing well, and they're going to become cankered as we grow up, but as they grow up, not we. But then we have this beech leaf disease that seems to be attacking younger beech trees and smaller and killing them, so young ones. So this is a U.S. Forest Service map of beech leaf disease where it's been found. It was found here in Ohio in 2012. This was a big deal. I remember I was in Sault Ste. Marie, and I went down especially when they found this. We had, forest pathologists are kind of a unique bunch because there's only really one of us in each province, if that, and PI doesn't have anybody. And then each state has a forest pathologist. So we're all pretty good buddies, and we all have different expertise. So when something happens, a whole whack of us landed right there about 3 or 4, I'm going to say maybe a month or 2 after it was found, because often people say, oh yeah, we found something, and it turns out to be nothing. But there was enough experienced people earlier to saying, hey, we're scratching our head with this. We don't know quite what it is. So I remember going down there on ground zero, and it was kind of fun because it's not a pathogen. You know, it doesn't look like a pathogen. There's nothing really to look at. And we have our hand lens out. It's microscopic. It's inside the leaf. We see some things. There were some, environmental events like drought happening, and was there a herbicide put down, or what was going on? So from 2012, it took some time to figure out what was going on, and then there was a whole whack of things. Is it really a nematode? And then we got a nematologist involved. Nematologists usually associate well with pathologists. But we only had one other tree nematode around, and that's on white pine. So I'm talking about all these things coming to us in Ontario and Canada, but we in Canada have exported pests too. And one of them is the pinewood nematode. And that's cost us a lot of money in Canada, because at one time we could ship green wood to Europe, meaning cut our pine trees down, cut the boards up, ship them over there, and they would do what they wanted with them. Now when we ship wood out of Ontario that's pine, it has to be kiln dried, and it has to be certified kiln dried, so that we're not transporting our nematode, which is a real concern. And there's other pests that we have too that do that. So this thing has spread. And one thing I would say about this, it really depends. Like when I came back to Ontario, I said, oh yeah, there's this new thing. I started looking for it. The technicians I worked with never saw it. And it takes time to train people up and then to determine if it's really something going on. So let me back up. So this spread happened quite quickly. Whoops, I keep doing that. This spread happened quite quickly from 2012 to 2024. But it doesn't always happen like this. It looks like it's radiating out. But what I can tell you is sometimes people weren't picking it up here because they weren't looking. And to look costs meals and wheels. You need to have people going out there who are knowledgeable, who know what they're looking for. And it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. You can't see these things. They're not always expressing the leaves. You look at the leaves and they're turning different colors. So finding the symptoms I'm showing you on the slides, those are really good examples. But when you're out there in your woods walking around a stand looking for something, it's quite expensive. So actually what happened here, Connecticut has some really good interested people. So it popped up here, as you can see, with the colors, and then this filled in because other organizations said, hey, maybe we should be looking at this. So when you look at the spread of these maps, you have to take it with a grain of salt. I mean, it's happening, but maybe if we looked here a little bit more, we would find it. The other thing is if you found one here, this whole section would fill in, so it depends on the county. So looking where we have it in more detail in Ontario, and this is 2024, the most updated map I could get. Here we have it, and it was found here first in 2017, and the more we looked, the more we found, and you can see how it's expanded. So if you remember where we had the beech trees from the other map we had, the range, it's moving through the range of beech. and it's killing trees. So in wrapping up my final couple of slides is the difficulties in dealing with tree pathogens. Well, the first one was we have a lot of failures. I can't think of any successes. Not one. I can talk about successful things that we did to try to manage them when we got here. Like white pine blister rust, we learned where the spores are effective, how far they move, what to do in plantations to make sure they survive. And of course, where we fail is educating people, our foresters, and people who think they can't grow white pine. So in Deep River, we can grow white pine very easy because we have sandy soils, and if you're growing them on your residential properties with lots of wind, and even in our forest, if it's not dense understory, we can make it work. They're cryptic. They can't be easily seen or trapped. And I throw this slide in here, the last thing a fly sees, because if it was a bug, we could see it, we can stomp on it, we can put chemicals on it because it's outside. The only bug I would say that this doesn't apply to that we have is the emerald ash borer, because the emerald ash borer has acted more like a fungal pathogen. It's cryptic. It came into the country. We didn't know it was here. We knew nothing about the science on the emerald ash borer when it came in 2002. I believe there was 2 papers written in Chinese with some different, not maybe erroneous information, but it wasn't really right. They thought it couldn't fly very far. If you recall, the CFIA delineated between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, a 10-kilometer swath where they removed all the ash trees and sometimes other trees because people misidentified them, thinking that would stop the spread. They thought it could only fly 2 kilometers, and then only to discover a few years later it was beyond that. So they spent millions of dollars. So my point here is that these things can't be easily seen. Long incubation periods, so they're sitting there in the forest doing nothing on trees, and they're spreading slowly. They can spread by water, air, or soil. I talked about the soil and the air ones. I didn't mention the water. So I had one other in there, sudden oak death. That's not in Ontario. We thought it was a big scare. It's found on the west coast. It's a water mold, an oomycete. It can spread through water. So it's a neat story. In Monrovia, the largest horticultural nursery in North America is down in California. Free light, has long daylight, good growing conditions. And what they found was that there was many horticultural species that can spread this disease, and it's killing oaks. This sudden oak death, which is now called Ramorum blight, is killing more than oaks, but oaks on the west coast, all the way up to BC, with this blight is killing them. And it's a water mold. So in this irrigation where they're watering these plants, they recycle the water. It drains down, they collect it, it had these oomycete spores, and they water their plants. And that nursery ships to every state in the US and even the potential 51st state, because we have plants that came into Canada with that. And that's where our phytosanitary things were happening. They restricted movement of plants in Canada. Monrovia virtually had to shut down for a long period of time. They sterilized all that soil, a huge area. I'm off topic. The native range and existence are often unknown. So like this nematode, Lily lynchus, we don't know where that came from. And most of those other pests, we learn after the fact where it came from. So if we knew something about the pest, like oak wilt, we know a lot about it. We know how it works, we know materials like that, but once it's here, very, very hard to stop. And I think once it's here, the movement of firewood, the movement of people, that's going to cause some issues. We have limited management options beyond prevention. So our prevention is really what we do at the borders. And trade is so important. So those 70% of those containers could still contain not just pathogens for trees, but insects and seeds. And finally, our quarantines are very difficult to enforce. So I don't really have a good quarantine story for pathogens, but for emerald ash borer, when it first came into Ontario in 2002, the CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, along with the MNR, tried to put quarantines in. So when it was down in the Windsor-Detroit area, I can't remember what they marked off, but there was a certain area that you were not allowed to bring firewood out of that area, and you shouldn't have moved wood products or things out of that area. Well, have you ever driven that 400 highway? Like what do they have in their trunks? I mean, if you bought firewood in a provincial park, how expensive that is. So you got this quarantine there. Who even knew about emerald ash borer? Who even knows there's a quarantine? So unless you know, so those quarantines they put in to try to slow the spread. But if you've watched what happened with emerald ash borer, it's like what's happened with most of these fungal pathogens. And that's why I say that insect is acting like a pathogen. It's moved right across the country. It's into Winnipeg. So all these measures to try to slow the spread only lasted for a short period of time. And the sad part is with the federal government, these invasives, when they're important in forest industry especially, they put these controls in. But once it's through Ontario, it's Ontario's responsibility to deal with these pests. It's Ontario that manages their forests. And what happens when a municipality gets these? It's the municipality's responsibility. So when we get emerald ash borer in Deep River, we will. It's going to be the town that's going to have to look after that, or you're going to have to look after that on your tree. And the final thing I would say is lack of resistance to our native populations. That's the real big thing about dealing with forest pathogens. And to find those resistance is a lot of money and a lot of time. And we have a lot of do-gooders and organizations that are trying to do some of these things in Ontario, like the butternut folks and maybe even some people with respect to the beach. But it's hard to share our experiences and resources. So if we're looking for resistance, in my mind, we should be, for example, beach bark disease, we should be going to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick where they've had the disease for 100 years and doing that work and supporting that work in that province with provincial monies maybe. And people have problems with that sometimes. You know, we should be looking at these things globally, more uniformly, so that we can get action. But spending money in little pockets here and there, in my perspective, we need to work together and go where we can probably get better results. So the lack of resistance to native populations, that's where most of this work is being done with these invasive species I talked about. It's the disease has gone through, we're seeing a lot of mortality in the diseases that are here, like Dutch elm disease, butternut canker, dogwood anthracnose. It's everywhere. So how are we going to protect those species? We're going to have to look for those resistance. And there is some people who are resistant to that. So some of that is hybridizing trees. So taking a tree like white pine, for example, there's taking Himalayan pine and taking our native white pine, crossing them genetically. And there's some problems possibly with that. We know that maybe they'll survive white pine blister rust, but are they subject to other issues? And we have found some of those in Ontario. With some of the work that was being done. And with that, I would say, are there any questions? This guy's carrying a butternut, so this is another way that butternut spread by somebody like that. Anyways, I think I've gone on long enough. So if anybody has any questions or not, yeah.
Is there very many butternut trees in Deep River?
Yeah, there's quite a few butternut trees in Deep River.
Have they got cankers?
There are some with cankers, and there's a lot without cankers. And even on ACL property, there's an old farm there, and I remember a number of years ago, I was asked to go look at the butternut. We put a plot in Pansy Patch, and I was looking for more plots. And then sometime later, somebody said, oh, there's a lot at ACL, or whatever it's called. And I went there to look at them with them, and there was this old farm field, and they said, oh yeah, there was this huge, large diameter, multi-stem butternut. And they said, oh yeah, a group was here collecting cuttings from it, saying, that's a good tree, we should take cuttings from it. And when I looked at the tree, it was virtually dead. And that's one of the problems that I have with some of the work that's been done from people with good intentions. They don't do the long-term studies. They didn't go back and look at that tree to see, is it really expressing resistance, or is it just because it's at the end of the northern range and that tree hasn't been subject to the disease long enough to see it? So when we put these surveys in, they're one-offs, they're not continuous studies, and that's what we need to do, is like, what happens in this area over a period of time? That costs time and money, and healthcare is more important, education is more important, and doing these things is expensive, and we don't want to do those, or as a society. Yeah?
Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I was just there on Thursday in Patch Park, and last week I think the mature butternut tree has really succumbed to the cankering. So
Yeah. If you go along the perimeter of that park, there are still some really good little ones.
yes, there are.
But the big ones are gone. And those little ones, I'm going to say 6, 8 inches in diameter. If you look at them, they're heavily cankered, and it's only a matter of time. Now, I say that, but there's always that hope, because there is always some hope there's resistance or tolerance. So I get myself in trouble because I go with the numbers and what we're seeing. But that's why these long-term studies are really important. We were hoping that one that I did, started in 2008, we would renew it. There was some interest. It's expensive to do, and the government people don't want to spend that money. Yeah.
And just another question was, is it true that also oak wilt disease can be identified by juicy fruit smell?
Yes. Yeah, good point. I forgot to mention that. So yeah, good. When you're walking through heavily infected areas, you can smell a juicy fruit. If you remember juicy fruit chewing gum, if you're those days, or a fruity smell, it's not always a good diagnostic thing, but if you're walking through a heavily infested or infected stand, you can smell that. I would say about 50% of the time. The other thing that's interesting about that disease, and when you're out with people in other states, because I was new to this disease, we didn't have it in Canada, so I went down to the States quite a few times to educate myself. And what I found interesting is I learned from foresters and forest pathologists down there what the disease looked like and the damage, and I was gathering information of what we should do in Canada and it's not a provincial responsibility. It's a federal responsibility. I worked for the provincial government at that time. And it was interesting because a lot of the foresters down there, I'd be driving around with them, and I'd say, hey, does that look like oak wilt over there? And they said, oh, no, we don't have it mapped up here. And I said, well, it sure looks like what you were showing me. And of course, we'd go out and stomp in the woods and look at it, and sure enough, it's oak. Oh, I better let people know. So that's one of the problems with these phytosanitary certificates and moving things around. So we don't really import much oak. I'm going to get myself in trouble with this stuff, but we don't import much oak into Ontario. The real movement of oak is really into eastern Quebec, eastern townships. That's where there's a lot of flooring mills, hardwood mills, and a lot of the wood that's all the way to Wisconsin and things comes across the border and comes into Quebec. And so Quebec, with their industry, fought very, very hard, and they've done a lot of work since. And I'm from Quebec, and I speak French, so I was down there quite a bit because actually, the Ontario government was very good because they allowed me to really beef up my skills and knowledge, and I shared that with Quebec. But all that wood's coming into Quebec, so they were really trying to protect their industry and find ways to allow this in. And of course, some of us were opposed to that because once the cat's out of the bag, but money talks. I forgot what the point was, but my point was a lot of people, even in their own state or province, sometimes don't know where those things are because we have to survey. And one thing we do have in the Ontario, we have these forest health technicians. There's 12 of them, and they survey the whole province in the month of July. They fly the whole province looking for major disturbances and even minor disturbances. So if they see a lot of gypsy moth or spruce budworm, those are mapped. They're all mapped out. You can go online and get the report. At one time they published it, and you can see even minor disturbances where there's little things, but it really depends on those people being able to get out there and look and sample, and people reporting it in the public. So you saw the Ed Maps thing a couple of nights ago if you're here for the plants. If you find something, you can go online, report it, and then other professionals can go and check it, or other people might say, no, that's not that, not yet. But you can see where the advancing of some of these things are. But with the pathogens, they're virtually everywhere. Yes?
Let's take the case of the emerald ash borer. Presumably it comes from Asia.
Yes.
Now, if you go to Asia, are there any ash left that's
Yes.
resistant?
So the interesting thing about the Asian emerald ash borer, in its own country, it's not causing problems because it's grown up, the beetle has grown up in unison with the ash trees there.
Okay.
So what Canada has done, or what the Americans have done first and Canada, we've gone there looking for parasites, parasitoids, insects that will feed on the emerald ash borer and releasing those. So there's quite a few. I believe they're still being reared in Sault Ste. Marie. Michigan was rearing a bunch of these insects. So what they do is they find the pest to the insect, And it takes a while to do this, and then make sure that they're not going to cause a problem in our own country. Then they rear up a bunch of these parasitoids, they're called, and they parasitize the eggs, or sometimes they parasitize the adults of the beetle. And there's a lot of work being done on that and still continuing. So with the emerald ash borer story, and I'm not up to date on that because I'm not an entomologist, a bug guy, but what I do read about it. So what the hope is that they're going to release these parasitoids, and it's not going to kill all the emerald ash borer. It's going to lower the population down so the ash can still grow. Now, what happens often is we'll find young ash trees. They can be affected by the ash borer, but it's the bigger trees that are usually attacked. And so, but they did put 2 of them on the endangered species because the population has dwindled. So the other aspect that people are hoping and doing is collecting ash from seeds from pumpkin ash and black ash to hope that we can make a gene pool, keep some of those seeds for the future. But what will probably happen is the parasitoids will control it a bit. We'll still have ash coming up, but I doubt we're going to get rid of the emerald ash borer. Like, there's no magic bullet, I think, for that. But who knows? It's only been here since 2002. Give it 100 years, like Dutch elm disease and beech bark disease and chestnut blight. I mean, maybe we will find something.
Is there anything analogous for fungi, for example?
As a biocontrol, no. Well, I say that I'll take that back because we do have a disease in Ontario. We're not sure where it came from. We call it invasive, but there's still a bit misnomer. We have a root rot disease called Heterobasidium annosum, annosum root rot. And it was found in Ontario in 1955, and it's down in Barrie area and down to the southwestern Ontario. It causes these nice pockets in red pine, especially plantations. It can go through the root system, as I showed you before. It can take out these pockets. In fact, I had a space talk on that. It was because they look like crop circles when you take pictures from the air. It looks like aliens landed and killed these trees. And that disease we used to control with borax, sodium tetraborate, a nasty thing for your gonads. We didn't know that at the time. A salt put on cut stumps. It worked very well. Canada took it off the market. Our PMRI, the pesticide regulatory agent, took it off after many, many years of use. And my first job in the MNR, I had 2 that I never solved. Well, this one I did solve. We were looking for another agent, and I kept writing US borax saying, hey, can we bring this stuff back to Canada? We have this mortality happening. And a Finnish company came to Canada, and in Europe they have the same disease, and they use another fungus to control it, Piniophora gigantea. It's sold in Canada now as rot stop. So you have this root rot disease. We registered a new product. It's a fungus that controls a fungus. You spread it on the stump of the tree that's been cut, and what it does is it occupies the stump. That fungus will grow, and then the spores from the damaging agent, the root rot, Heterobasidium, don't grow on that stump. So we do have an example. It took, that was a really fun story because it was about 25 years we didn't have a control, and then we found this biocontrol, and it's working well. But this is where our expertise of sharing with the States. Because I lived in Ontario and I had to deal with this disease, and we spent a lot of time looking at it, and when I came to Ontario, I had to educate myself with that. And here I am traveling in Michigan. In Michigan, people said, we don't have Heterobasidium root disease. So while I'm down there learning about oak wilt, we're poking around at some other stands, and I said, that looks like Heterobasidium root disease. And they weren't looking for it. They didn't know quite what they were looking for. They weren't paying attention in some of their plantations. And suddenly, a lot was known about Heterobasidium root disease. A very famous pathologist in the States was working on it for a number of years. But you have to have people going out there looking. And part of the problem with these diseases is you really have to see them. Showing them on a slide like this looks pretty and great, but until you go out there and you feel them and you kick them and you touch them with your hands, you don't really know them. And looking at a couple of leaves or lesions, it takes a long time. We say it takes about 5 years to train our technicians to do entomology and pathology to go out and collect. And I think that's very true after working. Even for myself, I like to see it and see it multiple times because it always looks different.
If you're out and you see something and you take a sample, is that going to harm taking the sample if you bring it in and take it to the natural resources or anything like that?
No, but if you suspect you have oak wilt, it's best to call the CFIA or your local forestry office, the MNR, because one of the concerns is if people try to handle it themselves, then we could be spreading it. So it's always good to let the professionals do it. I say that. And also the diagnosis of it. It's like oak wilt, the diagnosis is quite difficult. A really good example I have is oak wilt. Oak wilt was found mostly in the western states, and then New York found it, and then it was found west or east of the Finger Lakes. That's quite a ways from where oak wilt disease is. And New York found it, and the pathologist down there was really good, and they tried to eradicate it. They went in there and they cut everything, and it was on private land. It was in an urban environment, not a rural environment. So they had to not ask permission, but they did it. And of course the homeowner says, well, this big oak tree we had has been here and it's healthy. It doesn't have it, can we save it? And then there was some kind of discretion where it should have been, we're not sure, it's gone. Like that's the way you have to work. It's like black and white. Like you got to make sure you get it. Anyways, 7 or 8 years later, they had a blow up of even more. And the question is, how did it get so far away? It was several hundred kilometers away from the last infection was. But then they found it on Long Island, New York. And they were collecting samples and sending it in. And remember I mentioned that this fungus is a very virulent, it kills trees really quick and deadly, oak trees. But at the same time, the fungus can be overgrown by other things. On its own, it can't stand around. So you take a sample in Long Island, and then you send it to some lab, and you don't send it the proper way. It needs to be cool, quick, collected properly. It gets to the lab, and it comes up negative. But they got trees dying. And because the people down there weren't totally knowledgeable, and they weren't shipping properly, and we had those problems here too, like you got to do it right, you got to follow the protocols to get it to the lab. And when you don't, so for quite a while it went undiagnosed until Jennifer Jeswick, who was the US expert on this disease, went down herself and voila, there it was, collected the samples properly and they're confirmed. So the other thing with a lot of these diseases, which I think is problematic, is that we've relied on technology so much. We've gone to molecular means. And I'm a molecular pathologist. My training was in molecular pathology, and then I backed up 100 degrees and wanted to become a stump kicker, looking at the disease in the field. And part of what I did earlier after my PhD is I was interested in identifying, so I was doing a lot of lab work, identifying fungi the old-fashioned way. I spent some time in Holland learning diagnostics of sick building syndrome to identify molds. And we've lost those people. Like all the people coming out of universities now after me are molecular people. They don't know how to kick a stump. They sometimes don't know what the trees look like. They rely on just going out there and collecting a sample, taking it back to the lab and extracting the DNA. That's why our field technicians that we have in the province were so important, because they did know after a period of time and they could recognize things. So I think we've lost those old mycology skills, and certainly foresters who can recognize some of these things in the field, because that's a lot of what my job was, is going out there and solving problems that really shouldn't have been problems over a period of time. And I think that's the education thing. I should tell you, I teach a course in forest pathology still. It's a theory course. But when foresters take pathology at universities and entomology, the schools that I know, it's a one-year course or one-term course that involves 3 subjects. In the past, it's been fire, entomology, and pathology. A university course in that area usually is 37.5 hours a term with maybe some labs. What can you learn in 37.5 hours of what I showed you tonight in detail? So, I think sometimes we're undertrained in some of these areas where at one time we were real leaders. Like the US Forest Service and the Canadian Forest Service had a wonderful pathology branch, and it's all been removed. And what we have now are a lot of molecular people, not just in those areas, and we're relying on samples coming in. Now that works really well for definitive identifications, but checking in the field, I think the old skills are still useful.
So when there's a big movement to reduce environmental assessments, right, for project building and all that, But there's some of these environmental assessments surely will pick up some of these diseases and how you should treat the wood that you're going to take down, or the trees you're going to take down to prepare yourself for the next big project, right?
Right.
A railway line or whatever,
Right.
you know, pipeline or whatever.
Yeah, so with with the newer ones that are regulated by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, so something like white pine blister rust, nothing happens with. Something like Dutch elm disease, nothing happens with. There are all sorts of protocols on how to address those things and deal with them, but in the province, it's really, nothing is done with them because it's throughout the province. So the best practices are still there about how you should get rid of elm. So for example, there was a municipality, I won't name which one it was, a large one, that had a very large one. Was in Toronto. And somebody called up, a good citizen wrote the Minister of Natural Resources saying, I'm going to get myself in trouble with some of this stuff. Anyway, somebody wrote somebody, and a letter came back saying, there's a whole bunch of elm cuttings left on the side of the road. Shouldn't they be disposed of properly? And if you look at how they should be disposed, there's several suggestions. But since it's ubiquitous and everywhere, nobody does anything. But this person was concerned that they were piled up and left on the side of the road. So I had to answer this question. So I called up the municipality and I said, so what do you got? The forester, they usually have foresters. And I said, oh, what are you doing with your trees when they're cut down? And he says, well, we dispose of them properly. And I said, oh, okay. So I have this on this boulevard of this exact street, and I'm saying, what happened to that wood? Like it was bucked up and left there, and the neighbor said somebody came and collected it, like a private citizen. And they said, oh, what street was that? Oh, that's not us. That's a contractor we hired. And he likes to cut up the wood and buck it up, make it firewood size, and leave it at the side of the road. And then somebody comes by and collects it for firewood. And he doesn't have to take it to the dump and dispose of it properly. So he gets this free removal. And I said, So, of course I call up that company and say, so are you doing this? Like, that's not what's proper. But in reality, does it really matter if it's everywhere? So these newer pathogens, yeah, I think we don't want oak wilt spreading. This beech leaf disease, I don't think there's going to be much control in that, but we don't want that spreading. And it's not a regulated pest, as far as I know yet, so if it ever will be. And of course, once it's throughout the province, or whatever province it is, it's no longer the jurisdiction of the federal government. They can say, well, it's everywhere. That's the province's responsibility. And of course, when municipalities often write the province saying, hey, what can we do? Can we get money to do this, manage this? And they say, sorry. And then when a homeowner calls, because that's also a question that's come up, I've answered minister letters that way where people have written and asked, can we take care of this bug? And we would say, no, that's the responsibility of the municipality, or that's your responsibility. And most of the time it falls to the private citizen to deal with these. So all these things, once the cat's out of the bag and it's been ubiquitous, like Dutch elm disease and butternut canker and things, except for butternut canker, that's a regulated pest. Remember I said you can't remove your tree. Yeah.
You mentioned the maple trees. What was the situation with maple?
No, we don't have any real issues with maple trees. The big issue we had with maple trees quite a few years ago was Asian longhorn beetle, if you remember how bad that was. And it was found in Toronto area, quite a large area down in, I can't remember the streets, but Jane and Finch, a very rough area, I think that was where it was. And they removed a whole bunch of trees and just removed them, like went out there and marked. And they also marked about 800 meters around that. They removed the trees. They monitored it for 5 years. They found a few more, and then they monitored it for 5 years, and they figured they eradicated that. And what I failed to mention with the oak wilt, when they found those trees in those municipalities in Springwater and in Niagara Falls, CFIA has intensified their monitoring around those areas, and they're monitoring, I think, 1.6 or 1.8 kilometers out and doing heavier inspections to see if they can get rid of that if they should see it again. And they're going to do that for 5 years. But, if it's in Barrie so far away, then wow, how did that get there? And is it somewhere else? Yeah, so the Asian longhorn beetle is not in Canada now. It's still playing havoc in other parts of the States. And the spread is really removing those maple trees. You're probably tired of hearing from me. Nope?
Just one question, why is the CFIA involved? Because it goes about food.
Right, so the CFIA is more than food. It's they do all sorts, anything invasive to coming into Canada, they have control over. So initially, they were always, they're meat inspectors, plant inspectors. But they're the regulators for invasive pests and supposed to be keeping us safe.
We'll just limit it to one more question, if there are any. Otherwise, I would like to thank Richard for a very